Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and this is a real-world review of the Fuji X-H1. Today we're at a skate park in a part of Philly called Kensington, where I brought out a skater by the name of Blake, who we've worked with before, who's going to help us get different portraits, action shots, and to really test out the camera to see what we can capture. So now let's go and do it. This camera has a 24.3 megapixel APS-C sized CMOS sensor. Now, it does not have an OLPF, which should make it much sharper, but keep in mind that Fuji doesn't have a full frame camera. They do offer a medium format camera, which is much more expensive, so this is considered the top of the line camera in their crop sensor lineup. The base native ISO of this camera is 200, and it goes all the way up to 12,800. Now keep in mind that this is a crop sensor camera, so as your ISO goes up higher, you are going to start to see more noise and grain. Now this is the same ISO range that you find in the Fuji X-T2, and in low light shooting, it only focuses down to -1 EV, whereas most other full frame cameras and crop sensor cameras do -3 EV. So that really means that this isn't a camera that is meant for super low light shooting. The first thing that I asked Blake to do was to try a trick that I invented called a McFlurry. But honestly, I don't know what the trick is called, but it looked pretty complicated. Now this gave me a good opportunity to shoot with the 10 to 24 millimeter lens so I could get at a lower angle, test out the autofocus capability, and shoot at a higher frame rate. Now the focus seems to be keeping up pretty well, but we'll have to see how that handles for the rest of the shoot. One of the things I absolutely love about this camera is the 3.69 million dot EVF. Now that's more than what you will find in the Sony A7 III, and it's on par with what you find in the Sony A9. But what I love more than the Sonys is the fact that it has a nice eye cup, which helps shadow my eye from the sun, which makes it much easier to use this electronic viewfinder. And it also has a 100 frames per second refresh rate. Really just like look at the camera and shoot pictures. Do you want me to spit my gum out? You will find a 3-inch, 1 million dot, 3-way tilting touchscreen on the back of this camera. Now the touch functionality doesn't let you go through the menu system, which is really a pain in the butt, and you can't tilt it all the way down to 90 degrees. It stops somewhere around 45 degrees. Unlike most cameras out there, there is the ability to, when you're shooting vertical, pop the screen out and have it tilt. Now that may come in handy for some of you guys out there, but for me personally, I don't think I would ever use it. You also have the ability to use the touchscreen while your face is up to the EVF to move your focusing points. Now that would be great if they actually moved when you asked them to move and didn't follow 4 minutes later. So the camera is frozen and locked. It's locked on one of the pictures that I just took. Now I don't know if it's because we have an we're recording my EVF, if that's causing any issues, but this is the second time that it's done me and 2 times using this camera. So we're gonna have to figure out if it's having the Atomos up top or it's just a glitch in the camera. This camera offers you 325 autofocusing points using a hybrid AF system. When you're in AFC for continuous focus and you're shooting in continuous high for your frame rate, it only allows you to use the center portion of the frame. Now that's not something that I really like in this camera. Being that it's a crop sensor camera, I should be able to reach autofocusing points all the way out to the outside of the frame, just like full frame cameras like the A7 III. That camera has 693 autofocusing points all the way out to the edge, and it's full frame. This is a crop sensor camera, and I'm stuck to just using the middle, which gave me trouble with my composition when I was shooting vertically and especially horizontally. Now, if you do want to use all the autofocusing points, you kind of have to dumb down how many frames a second you can shoot to the continuous medium, or go into AFS, which will unlock all of those focusing points for you.
Battery's down 1 level already. Good thing I got 3 batteries in here.
One of the things that absolutely sucks about this camera is the battery life. you get roughly 310 shots per battery. But the good news is you can put 3 of them in your camera at a time. Now you can also charge the camera via USB, which if you're just sitting around and you've wasted a bunch of battery power, you might as well plug it in and get some charge. Now comparing that to the Sony Z batteries, the Z batteries crush this camera and these batteries all day long. It's backwards. It's backwards than what I'm used to. I gotta line up the orange dot, orange line with an orange line. What the? Ah, there we go. Locked in, make sure that I don't rearrange the aperture dial and then put my lens back in the bag. So the reason I picked Blake to work with today is not only is he a great skater, but he looks like Justin Timberlake, which should make for some nice portraits. Now the Fuji systems offer you the ability to change your aperture right on the lens. Now back in 1980 and 1990, that was great because you could go ahead and change your aperture because you couldn't do it on the camera. But at this point, it's my personal preference that I don't like having that on the lens. I find that I may accidentally hit it when I'm taking the camera out of the bag or changing lenses. I'm rotating it, and it's just one more thing that I have to think about that I don't want to mess up. Now, if you love going more manual and you like having the ability to click it, then this may be for you, but for me personally, I don't want this on my lenses.
That's super hard to move that focusing point, I'll tell you that. Holy shit, it won't go where I want it to go.
So if you're somebody who likes to customize the buttons on the outside of your camera, you're going to be very happy to find out that you can map out almost all of these buttons to do different custom functions that you might want to use. Fuji decided to replace the exposure compensation dial with a new top LCD, which is actually really cool. You can put almost any information you want right on it, and you have the ability to change it from black to white, depending on the situation that you're in or whatever your preference is. Now, if you're somebody who loves having independent dials for shutter speed and ISO, well, you'll be happy to find those 2 dials on top of this camera, meaning if you want to change your shutter speed from bulb all the way up to 1/8,000th of a second and you want to turn the dial every time, well, you can do that. I personally hate having that on a camera because in this day and age, you can change all of that right inside the camera. It's much quicker. Let me cut in here real quick to remind you that this video is brought to you by Squarespace. Now, if you're looking for the best turnkey solution to make your own website for your own photo portfolio or anything else, check out squarespace.com/FroKnowsPhoto to get a 14-day free trial. And if you decide that it's for you, well, go ahead and use the code FroKnowsPhoto to save 10% off your first order. Now let's get back to the video. Even though this camera offers you a lot of dials and custom functionalities for the buttons, it doesn't have one for user-defined settings like a U1 or a U2 setting that you would find on some of the Nikons, some of the Canons, as well as on the Sonys. I like being able to have the ability to set it to regular video and then switch a dial to get to slow motion video. This camera doesn't offer it.
All right. Switch back to the 24-70 equivalent, which is actually a 24-82.5 equivalent. I just can't ever remember the 16, whatever the hell they call this. It's the difference when you use those numbers. Crop sensor camera, you got to figure out what is it. And this is a 16-55, 2.8. Now, a lot of people complain that the Sony menu system is confusing and weird, but
But I'm here to tell you that the Fuji one is even more confusing and even more hard to understand. Now, of course, the more that you use it, it will become like second nature, but right off the rip, it's really difficult to figure out where everything is. It's almost like there's too much customization in this camera.
I'm gonna change from continuous to single if I can remember how to change my focusing points. It's old school style. It's like what my Nikons used to have. It has a M and a C for continuous and an S for single for changing to single focus. I'm in here looking for a menu option like I'm using a Sony camera because that's all up in the menus and stuff. It's just like the focusing points don't want to move very fast. And again, I don't know if it's because I'm using the Atomos or if it's just doesn't want to move very fast. I should probably take the Atomos off and see. Holy Jesus, but it takes forever to move and oh, that's because it actually doesn't go all the way up. No, it just stops right there. Look at that. That's because it doesn't go all the way out to the edges like the Sony.
One thing I want to let you know that we did is we updated to the latest firmware right before doing this real-world review. We updated to the 1.10 firmware, which helps you with better autofocus, but also in the viewfinder allows you to make the data, the shutter speed, the aperture, and other things in there much larger, because originally everything is really small in there and it makes it hard to see. But once you enlarge the shutter speed and the aperture and other data in there, it makes it much easier, especially for me to see. One of the main benefits of a mirrorless camera is the fact that you can shoot in complete silence. Now, you do have the option to shoot silent with an electronic shutter as well as with the mechanical shutter, which doesn't really make that much noise. Now, the problem that I ran into with the electronic shutter is that when I'm sitting there shooting pictures, I couldn't tell that I was actually shooting pictures because there's no indication on the screen. A new feature that was added that wasn't in the X-T2 is flicker reduction mode. Now that will come in handy if you're shooting inside of gymnasiums or you're shooting in areas where there's flickering lights. So that's something that I would turn on if you're in that situation.
Now I just switched over to the 90 f2 to get some pictures and portraits of Blake, not Justin Timberlake, just Blake. Blake will be getting some portraits with this 90mm, so let's do that. I'm having so much trouble with the vertical focusing points, trying to get them where I want to go.
It was really cool to see the skateboard there, to see the way that the background blows out of focus, even though he's nice and close to that fence. Now, I wanted to try and get closer so I could get my mediums, my tights, and my full bodies because I like to not crop. That's a personal preference. But then I thought it would be cool to try to get some low angle shots with him kicking the skateboard up. Now, because this is a 90mm lens, I wouldn't have the ability to do that, especially because on a crop sensor, you need to multiply it by 1.5.
Oh, it's not gonna work for me. But hold that, I might as well just find this picture. Just look right at me, I'm not in your nostrils.
I focused on just getting some horizontal portraits. Now, for the most part, that worked out pretty well, but I did notice some issues with the focus hitting the eye because of the backlight. Similar to what you will find in the Sony mirrorless cameras, you do have the ability to turn on face detect as well as IAF. Now, it even gives you the ability to specify between the left eye or the right eye, and in my usage, the face detect worked pretty well, but the IAF really fell short, which caused a bunch of my images to focus on the nose or just miss altogether. Now, if you are shooting in video mode, you will only have face detect, you won't have IAF, but that's the same as the Sony as well.
I'm just trying to get these wheels in focus, and again, I'm having trouble moving these focusing points.
Now, my recommendation for anybody who's interested in purchasing this camera is that you look into purchasing the booster grip because it adds a lot of functionality. Now, it's going to set you back $329 at the time of this recording, but it gives you the ability to put 2 extra batteries in there. So now you can use 3 total batteries because the battery life in this camera isn't very good. It adds a headphone jack. It allows you to shoot at 14 frames a second with the electronic shutter and 11 frames a second with the mechanical shutter. And it lets you record longer when you're shooting 4K. So instead of 15 minutes, you now get 30 minutes. If you're somebody who's going to utilize those 14 frames a second that this camera offers when you use the grip, well, you're not going to be happy to find that you can only get 40 JPEGs in a row before the buffer fills up, or 23 raw uncompressed images.
We'll get you back to skating soon. Camera just froze again. So I just had the camera this time freeze on me a little different than it did before. This time it didn't stay locked with an image on the screen. The whole screen went black. Then when I pulled out the battery pack to reset it, it then showed me that one battery was dead. So I don't know if the camera totally shut itself off and didn't auto switch over to the other 2, but it literally just went black on me when I was shooting, and now I'm also having trouble with this autofocus. It doesn't seem that I can get anything back into focus, so I'm gonna have to play around and see what's up.
You will find that this camera is 25% thicker than the X-T2. Now, a lot of that thickness comes in the hand grip because this camera you can actually hold on to and feel like you're not gonna drop it like the X-T2, which had a much smaller grip. It also has a weather-sealed body, which helps make it dust and water resistant. Now, to really showcase this 90mm f2 and the shallow depth of field, we moved Blake over to the fence and I shot from the side. Because here you could see that the fence goes out of focus and nails the focus right around his face and then falls out again in the background. Now, these portraits are where I tried to use the different IAF settings. Now, for some of them, I ran into issues where it was focusing on the nose. And in other cases, I was able to get really tack-sharp focus, and those portraits look absolutely amazing.
Do you smell that, Blake? Well, that's the smell of people smoking weed in Kensington, because that's actually what it smells like. No, that is a good question. Blake just asked me if he gets hurt on this shoot, is there liability? And honestly, yes, this is my photo shoot. If he gets hurt on my shoot, though, I don't know if I'm covered for skateboarding. I'm gonna have to check my gear vault for that. I don't know. I'll check into that. Good question. If you tripped over my bag right now and you got hurt, then yes, I'm liable because you tripped over my bag. So don't trip over my bag.
It was funny because I asked Blake to do this Justin Timberlake pose where it's like, hey, do this against the fence. He did it for a split second, and those ended up being some of my favorite shots from this shoot.
So I just realized that if I take my finger off the shutter, the IAF is finding his right eye, which is what I set it to. But as soon as I press the shutter halfway down, it kind of disappears. There it goes, it's back, it's a little box. But it's definitely not as good as the Sony. The Sony is by far the best IAF out there right now.
Do you ever find yourself out on a photo shoot going, what would happen if all my gear got stolen? Well, do you have My Gear Vault? It's the best way to input, organize, and protect your gear, and it's absolutely free. Download it right now at mygearvault.com for iOS and Android, and you can also get insurance quotes right inside the app. Now back to the shoot. Now here's a cool feature that's unique to this Fuji system, the ability for the camera to decide which shutter to use. Now depending on your shutter speed, if you're shooting up to 1/2000th of a second, you're gonna use front curtain electronic shutter. Now if you go up to 1/8000th of a second, it's gonna switch over to the mechanical shutter, and then beyond that, it's gonna switch to electronic shutter only. One of the upgrades from the X-T2 that this camera has is a 5-axis in-body stabilization, which gives you 5.5 stops of IBIS. A lot of people have been asking, how does this compare to the Sony A7 III's autofocus system? And in my opinion, I think the Sony blows this one out of the water.
I'm switching to the 70-200, though it's not actually a 70-200, it's a 50-140. Numbers, who needs them? Boop. And we're switched. Okay, here we go, Blake. I want to do, you're gonna grind something. I'm thinking like a pepper grinder. Do a 360 pepper grinder into a McHealy McTwist. That looks like this. You ready? You do this into a McHealy. Yeah, I totally screwed that up. You know, it's not a good idea to still be in single when I'm trying to continuously focus and I want to track him. So yeah, no, I'm gonna try it again. So I was just on wide tracking for that run and it was terribly back focused. I could watch as the focusing points were jumping away from Blake, and that's not where they should be jumping away from. They should lock on the Blake and they should continually stay on him. So I switched over into the mode for zone AF, and it was much better because it's a smaller area that can lock in on Blake and allow me to get the focus where I want it to go.
This camera shoots DCI 4K video up to 30 frames a second at 200 megabits. Now keep in mind, it does have a 1.17x crop factor. It also shoots at 120 frames a second at 1080p, and it offers you F-Log. Now Fuji is really pushing the fact that this camera is meant to shoot video. They added a new film simulator called Eterna, and that's what this looks like right here. You will find 2 UHS-2 SD card slots in this camera, which is great news because Sony does not offer that. Now, something that Sony does offer is the ability to shoot redundant photos and videos to both of the same cards. Now, the Fuji only offers you the ability to shoot redundant photos to card 1 and card 2, but it's great that they went ahead and put in 2 UHS-2 card slots. One of the things I wanted to test in this camera is the IBIS. Now, in order to do that, I wanted to try and get some smooth panning of Blake skating in front of me. Now, to do this, to cut down on the amount of light, I needed to use an ND filter because I need a much slower shutter speed. Now, if you don't have IBIS in a camera when you're trying to do panning, you may notice that the streaks in the background will bounce up and down like this. Now, in this case, I shot at 1/4 of a second all the way up to 1/30th of a second, and you can see that at 1/4 of a second, it's a mishmash of just out of focus and blurriness, but the good thing is that the IBIS worked really well because you don't see any issues with the panning and the streaks. For our real-world reviews, we like to try and use the camera that we're actually reviewing for these stand-up interviews. Now, in this case, we're not using the X-H1 because we ran into some issues trying to figure out how to set it up for audio. So because we're not using that, we switched to the Sony A7 III, and that's what you're seeing right now. This camera's priced at $1899, and with the grip, you're around $2,200. Now keep in mind, this is a crop sensor camera, and for $2,000, you can get a Sony A7 III, which is a full frame mirrorless camera. Now you need to determine which one is right for you. On the Fuji side, the lenses are going to be a little less expensive, and on the Sony side, those lenses are much more expensive. I wanted to cut in here real quick to ask you, have you signed up for the FroKnowsPhoto email list? Well, if you haven't, just look for this orange box over on the website, put your name, email address in it, hit send it, and I will send you a free guide to capturing motion in low light situations. Now back to the video. So here we are back at the factory to take a closer look at the raw files from the Fuji X-H1. Now, as always, you can download sample RAW files over on the website. Just look for this link on the screen or in the link in the descriptions. Go ahead and click that to take you over to those files. So here it is. Let's take a look at the first image. This is Blake going up for a trick, continuous autofocus, shooting wide with this 10 to 24 millimeter, 200 ISO. The shot looks really nice. The camera did a nice job, even with the backlight, to go ahead and keep the focus right on Blake. Now, I want to remind you, I'm using Lightroom. This is what I use for my personal workflow for editing all of my RAW files. I know some Fuji shooters say not to use Lightroom, but this is what I use. You can take the DNGs, and if you can open them in another program, by all means, go ahead and do that. You can also change different picture profiles or picture styles inside of Lightroom, so you can change from Provia or other options that they give you and not just use the Adobe standard. I left it on Adobe standard because that's where I leave my Nikon files. It's honestly where I leave all of my files when I go ahead and edit them. But I'm happy with how this image turned out. Moving on, I switched over to a longer lens, the 50 to 142.8, to do some portraits of Blake sitting here. I like the way that the black and whites turned out, and what I found out really fast in Lightroom is how sensitive the contrast is. Normally, I bump it all the way up to 100, but at 100, it got super contrasty. Now, that's not a bad thing. I like having more contrast, but I just had to make sure that I kept it a little lower for my editing because it really took it way too far. But nice and sharp, found the focus where I needed it to be in either the continuous or single focus, was able to nail that. Of course, you should be able to. Nice background bokeh because we're using the 50 to 142.8. Where are we out at? We're at 50 millimeters. So I wasn't even zoomed out, but the background isn't a distraction here, even with the chain link fence, because he's away from it, and then everything else falls out in the background. Moving in for a little tighter shot, put my focus point right on his eye right here, and that is super sharp. At 320 ISO, everything's looking really nice inside of this image, down to capturing some sweat getting ready to fall off his hair. The colors look good, the tones look fine, the focus is right on, so far so good with that. Just another portrait. Just wanted to switch over to the 16 to 55 to run through some different examples. Happy with how these turned out. The colors look good. The focus looks good. I mean, he's not moving, so of course the focus better look good. Came in closer because of his shoes. Nice and sharp. You got nice colors that you can work with here. Again, any camera is going to do something pretty similar to this, in my opinion. But you can check out the RAW files and see for yourself. Now let's move into some action. So this is where I ran into a little trouble with the autofocus system of this camera. I felt that it wasn't the best at tracking subjects coming towards me. At times, it ended up finding the background or this over here on the left-hand side and not really Blake where I needed it to be. But we nailed the focus on this one for tracking, but I did notice it didn't do as good of a job tracking as compared to some of the other cameras in the mirrorless world that I've used. Next up, I switched over to the 90 f2, and I know some people may be saying, well, why didn't you use the 56 f1.2? Now, I used that on one of the real-world reviews that we did with a Fuji camera prior, and I wanted something a little longer to give me that 130, 135 millimeter equivalent at f2 because I like shooting longer with portrait lenses. It really compresses the background. Now, I'm really far from Blake because I am shooting this one vertical and getting him all in there, but you can see that even the tree is out of focus. The fall off is very nice. Then I moved in closer from down below and the focus did okay with the backlight. I kind of missed a lot on this one because the focus would not nail his eye. It kept missing. So that's something to be careful with in backlight situations. It didn't do as good of a job. We also know that this camera does not focus as well in low light situations compared to some of its competitors. But look at the fall off around the fence right here. Everybody loves the prime lenses that Fuji makes. For my style of shooting, I like having the Hebrew Trinity style of lenses. The ones that give me wide zoom to middle zoom to telephoto, but throw in there one of the primes or two of the primes. If I had a Fuji setup, I would definitely be adding the primes because we know that they're really nice. But I'm happy with it. Look at this. We've got nice and sharp on Blake right here. We've got the fall off over here. Look how narrow the depth of field is. Now moving moving on to something a little tighter. This is where I put on their Pupil AF. I had a little bit of trouble with the Pupil AF. It doesn't seem to just move around and find the eye and stay locked on there like the Sony A9, A7R3, or the A7 III. It's definitely not as good as what the Sonys are doing, and it did cause me to miss in certain situations. For example, this, it just didn't hit it. It missed. It found the nose, and it shouldn't be finding the nose. Now, the Sonys, I will say, aren't perfect either. They sometimes hit the eyebrow, but for the most part, the Sony does a better job than this Fuji does. But my favorite shot from this entire shoot, that is definitely not Blake's favorite shot, is this one. Now, I know that the arm right here may throw some people off and say that it could be a distraction, but I go right into the eyes here. I'm drawn right in. It's super sharp. It's super clean. Really nice shot. So I think the camera does a fantastic job when it comes to portraits, but as you start to speed up the things that you're shooting, the autofocus may hold you back a little bit, because I found a little bit of an issue with the autofocus, as I said before. I showed you this one where we missed the focus, and then here, this is just me playing with the panning and using the IBIS of the camera, and the IBIS works very nicely inside of this camera. So the big question is, who is this camera for? You have to ask yourself, do you want a full frame camera like a Sony A7 III, which is $2,000? Do you want to get into that system? Or do you want to stick with a crop sensor camera where it's $1,900 and the lenses are less expensive than what you get on the Sony side? For me personally, I'm going full frame all day. I like the way that the Sony A7 III operates. I think it's one of the best cameras on the market for getting started today, having the full frame 4K, the great autofocus system. But what I will say, if you're somebody who likes having a lot of manual dials on the outside of your camera, the Fuji definitely does a great job at that. You can control your ISO from a dial. It helps you slow down. You can control your shutter from that dial. And if you love shooting with the primes, they got a ton of primes for you to shoot with, a lot of those manual features, and I know a lot of people love the Fuji system because they love the way that the colors pop. Personally, if you're just going to shoot JPEG, doesn't really matter. I highly suggest you continue to shoot RAW. But when it comes down to camera size, a lot of people switched over to mirrorless because the cameras were much smaller. In this case, the X-H1 is the same size, if not bigger, than a full frame camera from Sony. So you have to keep that in mind. The lenses are lighter, the lenses are less expensive, so that may be something for you. But one of the major downsides to this Fuji is battery life. It's atrocious. Any way you slice it, it's terrible. Roughly 310 photos before the battery's dead. The only saving grace is that if you have the grip, you can have 3 total batteries inside the camera. 1 in the camera, 2 in the grip, and you're good to go. But this camera didn't blow my mind. It didn't stand out to me as being, this is amazing, I must run out and get it. At the end of the day, it's not a choice for me. This isn't something that I would end up choosing to purchase. I would go a different direction, but you can take a look at the files that I captured. You can go and see that this camera gives you those dials and other manual abilities that the Sonys can't give you, and if that is for you, then maybe this is the right system for you to get into. So I'd love to hear your comments down below. Don't forget to give this a thumbs up because you love real world reviews. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And to check out another real world review, go ahead and click on the screen over here. And that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you guys very much for watching. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.